Exactly 12,000 years ago, humanity was still in its infancy. There was no writing yet. There were no wheels, no metal working. Hunter-gatherer communities living in small groups struggled to survive, battling the harsh laws of nature. But right at that time, there was a place. A point that turned everything we know about humanity upside down. A complex of temples, the heart of a secret. This place was Göbeklitepe, known as the zero point of history. Today, I will take you on a fascinating journey to the world's oldest temple, located in the fertile lands of Şanlıurfa. Together, we will decipher the language of the stones, unravel the meanings of the reliefs, discuss who built them, and perhaps shed light on the true starting point of humanity. Göbeklitepe is no ordinary archaeological site. This place is 7,000 years older than the Egyptian pyramids and 6,000 years older than Stonehenge in England. It whispers that human history has a much deeper, much more complex past than we have known until now. And today, we are preparing to hear that whisper. It all began in the 1990s. In a village in Şanlıurfa, a farmer plowing his field found a huge stone stuck in his plow. This stone was no ordinary stone. It was carved. It had figures on it. But the farmer was unaware of this. He reported the stones to the authorities and continued his work. Years later, when German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived in the region and saw these stones, he was stunned. Before him lay the remains of a structure that would change the entire history of humanity. And from that moment on, he dedicated the rest of his life to this place. Schmidt described Göbeklitepe as the world's most important archaeological discovery. The excavations began, and every new stone that emerged from the ground told a whole new story about humanity's past. Huge T-shaped pillars, animal reliefs on them, snakes, scorpions, lions, cranes, foxes, pigs, and reliefs resembling human arms. But the real shock came when dating tests were conducted, because the results were mind-boggling. These structures dated back approximately 12,000 years. That is, they were thousands of years older than everything taught until now as the beginning of civilization. So, how was this possible? There was no writing, no wheels, no metal. Yet stones weighing tens of thousands of tons had somehow been carved, transported, erected, and turned into a temple. Human history had to be rewritten. Göbeklitepe was telling us something very important. Perhaps we had always been wrong. Perhaps the agricultural society did not give birth to belief. Perhaps belief gave birth to agriculture. People came together to build temples, and they found a way to live together, to produce, to share. When we look at the stones of Göbeklitepe today, we see more than just stones. In them, we see humanity's first beliefs, its first social organization, its first dreams. The stones speak, and we begin to listen to the story they tell. But there are still so many questions. Who built this structure? How did they build it? And why, after using it for hundreds of years, did they deliberately bury it underground? In the rest of our documentary, we will seek answers to these questions. The story of Göbeklitepe actually began with the determination of one man. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived in these lands in 1994, he did not know he was taking the first step toward the greatest discovery of his life. However, the moment he saw the first stones, he realized this was no ordinary mound. Under the hot sun of Şanlıurfa, when he saw the massive stone blocks slightly protruding from the surface of the earth, the first thing that came to his mind was that this was an extraordinary sacred site. Schmidt would later describe that moment as follows: "When I saw this, my heart nearly stopped, because before me was something that would overturn everything I knew about human history. When the excavations began, the team was stunned, because every stone that emerged from the ground, both in its size and the intricate craftsmanship on its surface, did not align with known history. The T-shaped columns, some reaching up to 5.5 meters, weighed 10 to 15 tons. The animal figures carved on their surfaces were not only an artistic achievement, but also demonstrated the richness of the belief system. So why were these pillars T-shaped? According to Schmidt, these pillars actually represented humans. Some had arms and hands carved on their sides. In other words, these giant stones were human-like figures. Perhaps they represented gods, ancestors, or spiritual beings. One of the most striking aspects of Göbeklitepe was the way it was built. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people extracted the stones from quarries, carried them for kilometers, erected them, and arranged them in circles. This required a large social organization. But remember, these people were not yet practicing agriculture. The information we have suggests they were still hunter-gatherers. That is why Göbeklitepe turned human history upside down. Because until now, we had been told that humans first discovered agriculture, then built villages, and then religions and temples emerged. But Göbeklitepe showed the exact opposite. Here, belief came first. There was a temple, and perhaps this temple was the real reason that brought people together. Among the findings uncovered during the excavations were numerous animal bones. This suggested that Göbeklitepe may have been a kind of feast area. Perhaps people came here not only for worship, but also for large gatherings, ceremonies, and feasts. But the most interesting part was this. After being used for centuries, Göbeklitepe was deliberately covered with earth. People filled in the gaps between the massive stones and buried the site. It was as if they wanted to hide a secret. But why? This remains one of the greatest mysteries. Perhaps they wanted to protect their sacred site, or maybe their belief system changed, and they decided the old ways needed to be hidden. Klaus Schmidt and his team worked among these stones for years. Each new excavation season revealed another circle, another pillar, and each pillar raised new questions. Today, the excavated area at Göbeklitepe is only a small part of the entire complex, so there is still much to be discovered. Schmidt made Göbeklitepe the greatest work of his life. He worked here until the end of his life, and perhaps he managed to uncover a little bit of this greatest mystery of history. The greatest secret of Göbeklitepe lies not only in the enormous size of the stones or the reliefs on them. Its real importance lies in the fact that it has caused us to rewrite human history. Until now, the classic history we were told was this: people first discovered agriculture. Thanks to agriculture, villages were established and settled life began. After settled life came religions, temples, and rituals. In other words, belief was accepted as a result of civilization. But Göbeklitepe fundamentally shakes this understanding, because the temples here were built long before the beginning of agriculture. In other words, belief may have been the reason people came together, lived together, and discovered agriculture. Perhaps people gathered to worship gods or supernatural powers. When they gathered, they stayed longer. To stay longer, they turned to agriculture. In other words, agriculture may be a result of belief. This idea changed our perspective on human history. Because if Göbeklitepe is correct, religion was not only a product of culture, but also the driving force of civilization. Research conducted around Göbeklitepe also shows that the first traces of agriculture were found during this period. This strengthens the theory. People may have gathered around Göbeklitepe, performed their rituals, and then, having to stay longer, began to domesticate wild grains. Another interesting point is Göbeklitepe's connection to social organization. Building such a structure required significant social cooperation. This means that people from different groups and tribes came together and worked here. This could be the first example of large-scale unity among communities, and of course, the factor of belief. The giant pillars, human-like figures, and animal reliefs at Göbeklitepe had a purpose. They gave meaning to the community. Perhaps they calmed fears, perhaps they instilled hope, or perhaps they told people there was life after death. That is why Göbeklitepe is so important. It is not just a temple made of stones. It was humanity's first reason to come together. Think about it. Hunter-gatherers living in small groups came together without any obligation, worked together for weeks, months, erected giant stones, then held ceremonies together. This shows that there is a very powerful impulse in human nature, and that impulse is faith. One of Göbeklitepe's greatest mysteries is its end. Yes, humanity's first temple was deliberately buried one day, and not just buried, but carefully. Archaeologists saw that the temples did not collapse or disappear due to natural disasters. On the contrary, they realized that they had been filled with earth by humans. This was an incredible finding. Normally, a sacred place would be abandoned or destroyed. But at Göbeklitepe, people deliberately covered thousands of tons of stone as if drawing a veil of secrecy over it. But why? One theory suggests that Göbeklitepe had lost its function. Society had evolved, agriculture had begun, and new forms of belief had emerged. Perhaps this ancient sacred site was seen as a relic of the past and was being closed off. Another theory is more mysterious. Some researchers believe that burying Göbeklitepe was a kind of ritual. Perhaps the site had lost its sanctity and was considered dangerous. Burying it meant both showing respect and keeping it at a distance. An even more intriguing possibility is this. Göbeklitepe was so sacred to the people of its time that they wanted to protect it. Perhaps they buried the temple to preserve it for future generations. And we, thousands of years later, have rediscovered this sacred relic. Some theories are more speculative. Some suggest that a major catastrophe occurred during that period, perhaps epidemics or environmental changes affecting people. People may have believed that this catastrophe was related to the temple. Therefore, by burying Göbeklitepe, they believed they had sealed away the evil. Think about it. Tens of thousands of tons of soil were transported by human labor and filled between the stones. This could not have been done randomly. On the contrary, it was a planned, organized action. In other words, the burial of Göbeklitepe was as significant a social event as its construction. And this is where the real mystery begins. Why Göbeklitepe was buried remains a mystery. We may never know the definitive answer to this question. But one thing we do know, the people who buried it unwittingly left us a gift. Because thanks to this, Göbeklitepe was preserved for thousands of years. If it had remained exposed, perhaps rain, wind, and time would have completely destroyed it. The only reason we can see Göbeklitepe today is because of that deliberate burial. Perhaps this is the greatest legacy left to us by the people of the past. The burial of Göbeklitepe, like its construction, is shrouded in mystery, but this mystery only deepens its allure. And with every new excavation, every new discovery, we uncover just a small part of this mystery. Göbeklitepe is not just an archaeological site. It is a discovery that rewrites human history. Think about it. Previously, scientists believed that religion and temples emerged with the advent of agriculture. In other words, first food was produced, then societies became organized, and then belief systems developed. But Göbeklitepe fundamentally changed this understanding, because it was built thousands of years before agriculture. So people first gathered, built temples, developed belief systems, and perhaps these beliefs led them to agriculture and settled life. This completely turned our understanding of history upside down. So belief was one of the strongest bonds that brought people together. So sacred places existed even before cities. Göbeklitepe, a secret hidden underground for tens of thousands of years. Humanity's first great social project. The oldest evidence of faith, art, and consciousness. The hands that built it have long since turned to dust, but the legacy they left behind is still with us. Göbeklitepe is a gateway to understanding our past, but it is also a lesson for shaping our future. Because today, just as thousands of years ago, humans are still searching for meaning. Faith, community, and belonging are still at the center of our lives. Perhaps the greatest truth Göbeklitepe tells us is this: we humans exist not only to survive, but to come together, to share, and to believe. Göbeklitepe reminds us of who we are, and perhaps that is why everyone who sees it experiences the same awe. Humanity is much older, much stronger, much more mysterious than we thought. And Göbeklitepe is the starting point of this great story.